I'll be honest, I have become numb to biblical themes in horror movies, because after The Exorcist covered every conceivable angle of faith, mortality, the relationship between good versus evil, and so on, it left most horror movies, and even conventional dramas in general, very little room to creatively maneuver around the issue. Sure, there are countless biblically thematic horrors that subtly interweave these concepts and issues in mature, original, and thoughtfully humanistic ways, but then there's the not-so-subtle everything is a metaphor artsy-fartsy flicks that undermine these very issues, and make the whole idea of religion in horror a pretentious cliche. Then comes along Saint Maud, the debut psychological horror by writer-director Rose Glass that is not afraid to hit back at the overuse of metaphors and symbolism by delivering a stripped-down, deeply distressing, and all-too-real portrayal of extreme blind faith. Saint Maud tells the story of a devout Catholic called Maud, who takes a job as a private hospice nurse for a terminally ill atheist called Amanda, and soon begins to suspect that her divine purpose in life is to save Amanda's sinful soul before she dies. Story-wise, that's generally about it, because Saint Maud is predominantly a character study about a progressively unstable woman whose religious beliefs begin to fall into pure delusion, which for the more spiritual people out there, consider this your one and only trigger warning because it's not a pleasant look at faith, if indeed a potentially urgent one. Strictly speaking, Saint Maud isn't a traditional horror movie. It's a very restrained, voyeuristic, unreliable narrative where we see everything through the eyes of Maud, whose job of caring for a physically ill woman ironically parallels Maud's own inability to care for herself mentally. In the opening, we see Maud in her previous life as a hospital nurse left traumatized by the death of a patient, leading to what we can assume to be a period of depression and existential crisis as she eventually found hope in God, who she believes to be the one and only means of redemption and salvation. However, what I think makes Saint Maud so powerful is how it dismantles all its ambiguity in the end. Obviously, I won't talk about spoilers just yet, but reading and listening to writer-director Rose Glass discuss the film and her intentions highlights how genuine and real the story aims to be. Unlike most biblical horrors, it doesn't lean heavily into metaphor or visual subtext, bar two specific points I'll highlight later in the video. It's a pretty typical day-in-the-life semi-kitchen sink British drama for the most part, where we witness Maud's increasing disconnect from reality as she isolates herself more and more, to the point that her sole interaction with the world outside of caring for Amanda is praying to God, who she feels has a literal, physical presence over her. In fact, the film's major overarching motif is Maud's sexual repression, whether it be in her jealousy of Amanda having a sexual relationship with another woman called Carol, or ending up in a confrontation with a man who rapes her, leading to the implication that she once had a more sexually charged past following her traumatic breakdown, or speaking of Maud's own delusions, the idea that she is physically in love with God as she gives seemingly orgasmic reactions every time she prays to him, a godgasm as Rose Glass elegantly puts it. Its most crucial and potentially only layer of subtext, and it will make sense why in the end, is that Maud's relationship with God is a manifestation of her trauma and the things that she personally feels guilty and thus sinful for in her past. It is implied that the patient who died was partially a result of Maud bursting their chest during CPR, which is actually based on a real harrowing PTSD story told by Rose Glass by a nurse that lingers in the form of this persistent atmosphere of death that Maud can't escape. Now, I'm all for symbolism, and you could validly argue Maud's behaviour is meant to be biblically symbolic as it gets more violent. For example, she self-harms the palm of her hand and later puts on shoes filled with nails, which could be seen as a ritualistic portrayal of the wounds of Jesus Christ, which is then reinforced by the trauma of her crushing her patient's chest during CPR, the location of which Jesus just so happened to be stabbed on the cross. Oh, and then you could also say the scene where Maud bleeds into draining water is a direct metaphor from the Gospel of John that describes how the stab wound of Jesus bled both blood and water, and you get my point. There are many ways you can bleed completely valid and interesting symbolism from it. Hell, in one interview, Glass even compared Maud to Joan of Arc, the Catholic saint who is believed to have heard the voice of God similar to Maud, and then there was actual reference made in the film to Maud being like Mary Magdalene, who devoted her life to following Christ even if she had to suffer. It can get really fucking deep if you wanted to, but all of this line of thinking reverts back to the film's core point. This is how Maud interprets her faith. This is her delusion, or as she would put it, her suffering to earn God's love. She is the one hunting for signs and symbolism in everything she sees. She's constantly praying to God to explain his unclear messages, and eventually gets frustrated and lapses back into her old ways when she doesn't get an answer. The film is not a criticism of belief systems, it's trying to explore those who take it to such an individual extreme extent. At one point in the story, Amanda even gifts Maud with a book of paintings by poet and artist William Blake, who was best known for his work on Dante's Divine Comedy, and his visually terrifying interpretations of heaven and hell. Maud sees this, along with Amanda's note calling her a savior, and of course Maud, not reading Amanda's sarcasm, takes this very literally as a sign of fate, even going as far as replicating the images of angels and saints, and manifesting these paintings into her nightmarish delusions. Every symbol, every implication, it's all a sign from God in Maud's eyes, and believes it was God's design to bring her together with an atheist to save her soul. All of her actions and experiences have legitimately logical explanations stemming from her own mental illness. She justifies her self-harm as a reaction to having committed sins of envy and lust, while the levitation scene is simply Maud having an epileptic seizure due to the fireworks. The story does show how important religion can be to people as a crucial coping mechanism when it comes to loss, uncertainty, death, and just the general stresses of everyday life. The fact that the film inadvertently released during the current pandemic makes it feel even more real, as most of us had more time to be alone and think about life's sudden and harsh fragility, and it's a sentimentality that is echoed in the film. But Maud takes it to such an extreme extent that the only way to happiness and salvation is to suffer, and creates her own delusional metaphors to justify her increasingly unstable behaviour. However, to go any further involves major ending spoilers, and whoo, does it get intense. From my experience, when I used to go to church, youth groups and so on, there was typically two interpretations of God: the loving, forgiving, caring God, and the merciless, vengeful, spiteful God, judging your every action on this earth to determine your place in heaven. I find that the film sides very aggressively on the latter interpretation, where God is practically the villain of the story. He appears malevolent, sneaky, unclear in his messages to Maud, and most striking of all, his physical form is literally that of a cockroach. In the opening, we see the traumatized Maud, who back then was known as Katie, backed alone into a corner staring at the ceiling where a cockroach lingers. And then later in the film, the cockroach reappears and approaches Maud's shrine, where she then begins to actually talk to God. Now, commonly in these types of films, it's open to interpretation as to whether it's all in the main character's head, or things are genuinely becoming more otherworldly, but the payoff here is so sharp and so to the point, and just incredibly raw, because it rips away the ambiguity and literally answers any and every question you have in just a few final frames. So on the final night, MAUD approaches the dying Amanda and tries to bless her and pray for her soul, but Amanda fights back by scorning MAUD as delusional, mentally ill, and should seek help from actual people instead of some invisible man she cannot see. But having seen the world through MAUD's eyes, where she physically believes to have talked to God and seen his signs, her delusions fight back, presenting Amanda as possessed by the devil, and MAUD kills her. The very next day, with her mission now complete, MAUD grows a pair of angel wings as seen in the work of William Blake, goes to the local beach, stands beneath what she thinks is the portal to ascend to heaven, covers herself in propane and, well, self-immolates. In her eyes, she is now a saint, and the locals drop to their knees in awe, realizing there really is a god. But nope, in just a few final frames, the film strictly confirms that everything she saw was of course nothing but a delusion. Yeah, sure, you can be all conspiracy theorist about it and say that the devil possessed her after she killed Amanda or whatever, but that would be fundamentally missing the point of the story. As writer-director Rose Glass says, this happens in real life, so it makes sense to show both sides of it. The one where MAUD is at peace with her own spiritual fantasy, and the reality where she is just literally burning alive in front of shocked onlookers. In that respect, it would be more harmful to leave this ending open to interpretation because it would weaken the message about the individual extremes some people take their religion. The true horror of Saint Maud rests in Maud's loneliness. She locked herself away from the world and tricked herself into thinking God is the one and only cure for her sadness and stress, when in reality she clearly needed others to support her, which is what Amanda and an old colleague tried to give Maud, but she inevitably pushes them away because her delusions intensified. Faith is a powerful coping mechanism, an essential one for many, and the film does not dispute it as inherently evil or potentially leading to harmful behaviour. But the point it does make is that we are still mortals influenced by the things that we see, do, feel, and are taught. And so, regardless if you find hope in something spiritual, human connection on this earth will still be unquestionably valuable.